Good morning, everyone, and thank you for attending today. Appreciate the really kind introduction from Diana. We love doing these for our agent partners. And like Diana said, I am with Westcor Land Title. And I'd be doing a disservice to Westcor if I just didn't plug them for a little bit here, and I indulge your patience. Thank you. Westcor is the largest privately held underwriter in the nation. They are a very aggressive underwriters, meaning that if you have a deal that's a little hairy, and we have a lot of deals now where we have a death of the seller and probate and crazy litigations regarding that. Anything hairy like that, we tend to find a way to close them where other underwriters can't. So hopefully, because of our private nature, we're a privately held company, we're able to take certain risks a little bit more so than our fellow underwriters. So next time you have a little bit of a crazy deal, give Westcor a shout out and we're happy to help you. So I have to give you guys a mandatory announcement from the New York State Real Estate CE Board. You're going to be receiving your credits from Cape School. And upon completion of this webinar, you'll receive your CE certificate of attendance within 2 to 3 weeks from the date from today. And the following will be required of you to receive credit for this course. You're entitled to a 10-minute break, but after each hour, but in the interest of time and finishing earlier, we will work through without a break. So we're going to end about 11:40-ish, hopefully. You're required to attend the entire webinar. You must attend the entire webinar session to receive credit for the class. If you are late or leave early, Cape School reserves the right to decline to give you credit. Outside activities are prohibited during class. You may not text, make phone calls, check emails, do work, be on social media, or the like during class. Your full attention and participation are required by the New York State Board of Real Estate. Your attendance will be monitored electronically by the Zoom platform, and you must have your cameras on so that your faces can be seen. This webinar is being recorded. 2 codes will be announced during the course of the class. You must provide these 2 codes on the survey that you should have received. For the reminder, Diana did attach that survey link for all of you, and as well as an affidavit that is required by Cape School. So in order for you to receive credit, you must complete the survey, complete the affidavit, and provide us with the 2 codes that will be provided to you during the course of the class. So let me just, I hate to be a little strict with the codes, but the codes are what reinforce the fact that you joined us, as well as the video of your faces, okay? So once those codes are given, and once I leave that screen, those codes cannot be repeated, and you cannot call Diana or myself to get the codes. You have to write it down on a piece of paper, and please write it down on a piece of paper and provide it to us on the survey. I'm sorry for being such a stickler on that, but that's, we could lose our license to teach if in fact, we give out those codes afterwards. So I thank you for your cooperation, and let's get on with our CE. So today is a very unusual topic. We're not discussing any sort of statute, any new case law affecting your industry. There's no discussion about title or any real estate sales. Today we discuss an important, but it's a difficult topic, even for myself. You know, I've taught this class several times already, and every time I teach it, I hesitate because, you know, it's anything related to diversity, as everyone is aware, and diversity is everywhere. So it's not like, you know, I'm talking to folks who've never heard that word, right? But it's a difficult topic because people get uncomfortable. People get uncomfortable about talking about race and biases. So I invite you to, and it's great because we're online, so it's a little bit more comfortable. But I don't want you to look at the materials today. Okay, save that for your review of what I will present to you, and look at the materials afterwards. But just listen to me today. Okay, put the materials away. Give me your attention, because an hour and 40 minutes really does fly by. Because this requires us to put a different hat on, and listen with an open mind. Okay, I get it, and you don't have to believe what is being said. You don't have to buy in. Okay, but I think it's important for all of us to understand it. Okay, so I think we would have all our heads in the sand if we were to ignore all the cries for the elimination of bias and encouragement of diversity. I mean, this slide represents just a handful of cries throughout the nation about diversity, as you know. So my intention today is to inform all of you, to help guide your behavior on a go forward. You know, there's no right or wrong answer here, and because you have implicit biases does not make you a bad person. Okay, does not. And let's walk in with learning this information together with that mindset. Implicit biases are not bad. They happen. You have them. And it's important to recognize that you do. Okay. So let's explore what we mean by these implicit biases. I think in order to understand what implicit biases are, it's important to understand what biases are and what implicit biases are not. So let's look at these three words. Okay, and I obtained my definition of these three words through the Georgetown University's National Center for Cultural Competence, which I rely on a lot. It's a great research arena if you wanna Google and see what's available. So let's talk about prejudice first. So according to Georgetown, the prejudice is an unreasonable dislike and distrust of people who are different from you in some way, especially because of their race, sex, religion, or some type of disability. Someone is prejudiced when they make assumptions or generalizations about others without considering their individual qualities or merits. So, for instance, you dislike a particular race because you think they're likely to commit a crime, or you dislike a particular race because their religion represents terrorism. Those are instances where a person is prejudiced. Discrimination is the unjust or prejudicial treatment of different categories of people or things, especially on the grounds of race, sex, or age. So discrimination actually requires some sort of action, okay? Unlike prejudice, you're taking action. For instance, you're refusing to rent to someone because of their race, or you're denying medical care because of their race or religion. Racism is a specific form of prejudice, okay, based on the belief that different races possess distinct characteristics, abilities, or qualities that distinguish them as inferior or superior to another one. For instance, engaging in hate speech to demean or degrade certain groups. So what do these three have in common? These are all forms of overt or explicit bias. Okay, you're actually in the front of your brain and you are thinking and you know that you are doing, or we are doing, I don't want to say you, because it's not just you, it's all of us, okay? We have these overt or explicit biases that we are now thinking about these groups and how we feel about them consciously, okay? So what is a bias? Bias is a tendency or inclination, conscious or unconscious, that influences your judgment or decision-making in favor or against a particular group. Bias is broader and can include any one of these three forms of biases. So since these are forms of biases, let's understand where we get these biases from. So your brain is actually a very powerful computer. Let's just put it there. And these machines possess both an unconscious and conscious brain. And some scientists refer to them as system 1 and 2. So even if your conscious brain believes that people of all races, sexual orientations, genders, or religion are of equal value and deserve fair and honest treatment, your unconscious brain may get in the way of that. We like to put people in categories. And how did this evolve? Human beings are by nature tribal or possess an inherent concept of us versus them. So in the earliest days of tribes, when a stranger is introduced to the tribe, it's important for members of that tribe to determine whether that stranger possesses a threat. So your automatic brain, understand that, remember, your automatic brain, your conscious and unconscious brain work in tandem. They can't separate the two, right? So the automatic brain makes an immediate connection as to whether the stranger is us versus them. Do you ever have one of those moments where you feel like, wow, my spidey senses are, when you meet someone new and your spidey senses seems to be on point, and you're wondering why, you just don't like somebody, or your spidey senses tell you that I really like this person. It's as if I have met them before. So that's your unconscious brain thinking, not your frontal brain, right? Because you can't place, you can't place why you're thinking a certain way. So think about it in that context, and I think you'll on a go forward with the presentation, you'll have a better understanding of what's going on. So biases become wired within our human brain because our unconscious brain forms negative or positive relationships based on our own personal experiences. They become wired within the human brain automatically. We have no control over what our brain remembers based on the experience that we have. So our biases are created based on what our brains remember from a certain contextual experience. But our brain makes associations or systematic thinking errors, and these are what's called biases, and learn through culture, experiences, and are very much contextual. Someone's brain may interpret a certain experience differently than another brain and will create a bias from that experience, but another person may not. So it's an interesting concept, this conscious versus unconscious brain, and it really does exist. So it's this implicit bias is based on science. Okay, so let's think of biases like an iceberg. Um, we have the iceberg's surface, right? Which is your observations. You see a person, you see how they dress, you see their actions, you see their energy. And on the surface, then you summarize what you saw, and then you create your opinion. So your opinion is likely infused with some of your explicit biases. You see someone, the way they dress, oh my goodness, why, they're showing bare midriff, they're showing a little too much leg, you're forming, what you think of people when they present themselves to you. This is your surface brain. This is what your conscious brain thinking and associating certain of your biases to this person. Your implicit biases are your beneath the surface, and it runs deep. This is things we don't see. It's your own unique story that your brain learned, right, through your own personal experiences. It's your own unique story, and it's impacted. Your implicit biases are impacted by the repeated exposure to certain associations, conditioning, societal and cultural messages. So for instance, it starts young, right? So gender roles. Boys are rewarded when assertive and competitive, while girls are rewarded when they're nurturing and cooperative, right? Exposure to social and cultural messages that shape understanding of the world and attitudes towards certain groups by family members, media, education. Think about all this that's impacting your implicit brain or your implicit biases. Education, peer groups. Like for instance, you have a family gathering and where negative jokes are made about certain ethnic groups that is heard by a child, right? So that child forms certain child's brain, not even that child, because the child doesn't know anything, right? They just form certain biases based on what they hear and the experience that they have. So you don't know what information your brain decides to retain. It's contextual and depends on everybody's personal experiences. So the first reinforcer that we have is and obviously we don't have a poll, but just for your thoughts, okay? Your automatic brain gets in the way of your belief that all people are equal value. Is that true or false? That is true. Even if you honestly believe that people of all races, sexual orientations, genders, or religions are of equal value and deserve fair and honest treatment when dealing with you as a person or as a real estate professional, your automatic brain may get in the way of that, even without you knowing that it is happening. So let's talk about, now that we know what implicit biases are, and this is about the time that I've presented this live, and I see the eye rolling and I lose some of you because you're like, this doesn't exist, Toni. I don't know what you're talking about. Keep your attention. Indulge me with your attention, because it might sound a little fangled and this new age stuff, but it's based on science, okay? And I do believe that it does play a major role in some of the things we can't explain about a diversity and biases. So come back to me, and listen to some examples of the implicit biases that have been discovered. So the first bias is called availability bias. So your most recent or vivid memories influence your judgment or your decisions. That's availability bias. So for example, there was a study that was conducted to demonstrate this bias, and participants were presented with the following fact scenario. A defendant runs a stop sign while driving and collides with a garbage truck. That's a fact scenario. Defendant is being tried on evidence that he may have been drunk while driving. His blood alcohol was not tested at the time of the accident. And jurors were given two scenarios. Were given two descriptions of the defendant's behavior at a party just before the accident happened. The first description was, on his way out the door, the defendant staggered against a serving table, knocking a bowl to the floor. The second scenario was, on his way out the door, the defendant staggered against a serving table, knocking a bowl of guacamole dip all over the white carpet. So one is more vivid than the other. And what they found in this study was the jurors who were told that the defendant knocked the bowl of guacamole all over the white carpet were more likely to find the defendant guilty. So availability bias is at work. So one of the more closer to your home is where real estate agents showcase the standout features of a piece of property to create a positive initial impression so that the buyer overlooks negative aspects of the property, like an outdated bathroom or small bedrooms. Okay, so that's availability bias. The next type of bias is called, and a reminder, these are implicit biases. Okay, so I just shorten it, but it is these are implicit. Affinity bias is where you subconsciously favor people who we feel share our interests, beliefs, and background because we get a sense of familiarity and comfort. And we're likely to provide more opportunity, resources, or recognition to the people that we're biased, are implicitly biased towards, right? For instance, a hiring manager notices on a resume that a candidate graduated from his or her same college. This positive association with his or her college could implicitly inflate the candidate's qualifications, allowing them to be hired versus someone who was not from that same college. In another study, and by the way, all these studies are part of your materials. In another study, a doctor was treating a patient for a severed thumb. And the patient advises that she really loves to knit and hopes that this injury doesn't prevent her from doing what she loves. And on another patient advises the doctor that she graduated from Yale, the same college that the doctor graduated from. And the doctor in that instance called the best hand expert to ensure the patient receives the best treatment. So this is that us versus them mentality. And likely, and the same services were not offered to the other patient. Confirmation bias. This bias is triggered when you're confronted with information that is contrary to your belief or understanding. So for instance, when a real estate professional recommends a Black neighborhood to Black buyers because they're Black, or white buyers to white neighborhoods because they are white. Or dedicated conservatives follow Fox News and dedicated progressives follow CNN or MSNBC and will rarely watch either group's networks, because you're trying to confirm your own biases, right? Your own implicit biases. Attribution bias is when people evaluate their behavior or behavior of others and draw conclusions from them. For instance, when a coworker shows up to a staff meeting late, and others may automatically think or assume that that person is late, who's late is lazy or disorganized, because they themselves would not be late. So because you're not late, your brain is saying, oh, they must be lazy and disorganized. Students who consistently perform poorly on exams may lead a teacher to or classmate to assume that the student is not intelligent or lacks motivation. instead of considering other factors like language barrier or maybe inadequate study resources or personal challenges affecting this student. Or a real estate agent attributes a client's rejection of a property to a client's financial limitations and does not consider any other factors. That's attribution bias. Conformity bias are individuals who change their beliefs or behavior to align with opinions or actions of a larger group, even if they personally hold different views. So for instance, adopting a particular fashion trend because of its popularity, even though they don't personally find it appealing. The halo effect. When you place a person on a pedestal after learning something impressive about them, for instance, a supervisor gives a higher performance review to an employee who has positive attitude and spends a lot of time at the office, but is not as efficient as the other employees. They're placing this employee on a pedestal because of his positive attitude, and it then turns out that they are the ones with a better review and a better raise because of that. Horns effect. The Horns effect is the opposite of halo. We assume the worst about someone because of one negative observation or trait without considering other factors. The same example that I already gave everyone is that person who is late to the meeting because they're lazy or unorganized. Ageism is when we stereotype because of someone's age. We speak louder to older people because most older people are losing their hearing. So we assume all old people need to be spoken to loudly. Oh, finally, name bias. Name bias is when we prefer names that are familiar to us, and hiring managers tend to have an affinity towards names like Mary, Susan, rather than my name, Maritoni or Alistair, because they're different. Additional types of bias, these are actually proven, unfortunately. It's all part of your materials. Beauty bias is when we obviously hold those who are more beautiful than others in higher regard because of their beauty. So 2 studies included in your materials are attractive people have an advantage over less attractive people, more likely to be interviewed for jobs and hired, and they're more likely to advance rapidly in their careers and earn higher wages than their unattractive counterparts. All with the same qualifications, unfortunately, right? Height bias. People tend to judge a person who's significantly short or tall. A study found that a person who is 6 feet tall earns roughly $5,500 more than a person who is 5'5.5" tall, regardless of gender, age, or weight. In another study, tall candidates are perceived as more competent, employable, and healthy, which may explain why 58% of CEOs at major corporations are over 6 feet tall. It's interesting. These are interesting, and it's happening. So it's tough not to believe that these implicit biases are causing some of our decisions, right? So anchor bias is when people rely on pre-existing information or the first information they find when making a decision. For instance, a study conducted asked various real estate brokers or agents to provide a value estimate on properties with identical characteristics. And some were given a high listing price and others significantly lower price. Those who were given the higher listing price tended to give higher valuations of those properties than those who were given the lower prices. And brokers did admit that they considered the listing price when making the estimate. Another example of anchor bias is when, in car sales, the sticker price, and that's why they have the stickers out there, are usually higher, right, than what the dealer is willing to accept. And so from a negotiation standpoint, the buyer will negotiate from what they saw, right, rather than what they believe should be the price. Okay, nonverbal bias. Nonverbal biases are triggered when these nonverbal communications are misunderstood or emphasized in making decisions about a person. Like 4 types of facial expressions, for example, are universal among all cultures: happy, angry, sad, and fear. Anything else in terms of facial expression can be interpreted almost any way, depending on people's implicit biases, right? Gestures. Universal gestures include waving, hello, right? Pointing and showing your fingers as quantity. Other gestures, you're gambling. You're gambling there. Body language and posture vary among cultures. Authority bias is actually one of the more interesting studies that I provided to you. It's a tendency of people to obey a person in authority and to agree because of their desire to support those with authority. So Milgram is an experimenter, and he conducted this experiment on 40 males between ages 20 to 55 to 50 to see how far people would go in obeying an instruction that would result in harm to others. The males were introduced to a participant. So each of these males were separate. Okay, the experiment was conducted separately on all 40. They were introduced to a participant who was working with Milgram, and we'll call that participant the learner. Okay, the participant and learner drew straws to determine their role as learner or teacher. And the point of this was that they wanted to find out because the student was actually or the learner was to give answers, and the participant was to determine whether or not the answer was correct. And if it wasn't correct, then they were to introduce a shock to the participant. Also in the room was a person in a lab coat, also working with Milgram, and he was the authority figure. And if the student refused to give the shock, it was up to the lab coat guy to tell him to do it. So the learner who was working with the experimenter here mainly gave incorrect answers so that it would force the participant to introduce the shock. And as the learner gave wrong answers, the voltage progressively got higher, okay, for every wrong answer. So the study found that all participants continued to give the shock to up to 300 volts. 65% of the participants continued to the highest level voltage of 450. So what the study showed is that people are likely to follow an order given by someone with authority, even to the extent of harming another person. And a real world example of this is actually the Germans who asked to terminate the lives of Jewish people. So that study is provided for you in your materials. And lastly, overconfidence bias is the unjustified confidence in your abilities. So for instance, a real estate agent who consistently overvalues properties that they're selling because they're very confident that they can, of their ability to sell. Another example is a real estate agent who dismisses input from colleagues or inclined not to seek input of colleagues, believing they have the necessary expertise and insight. So those are your implicit biases that are working without you knowing. So I've identified them here for all of you because I think it's helpful to know what implicit biases look like and what they are and how they affect your decision making, right? So all these are examples. I gave you examples just to give you insight, right, on how these biases can actually, that you're not even, reminder, the processing of these biases are occurring outside your control. They're not even a part of your thinking as you're going through your daily decision making, right? It's happening without you knowing, but knowing that they exist brings it to the front of your brain so that you can think about it when you're making your decisions. So just to recap, because there were so many, your most recent or vivid memories influence your decisions disproportionately is availability bias. And you'll see this as we progress, most of the examples that you will see are just to reinforce these biases so you're aware of them, okay? Subconsciously gravitating towards people we feel share our interests, beliefs, or background is your affinity bias. Ignoring or avoiding information that's contrary to our beliefs or understanding is confirmation. Lateness attributed to lazy or unorganized is attribution. Groupthink is conformity. Placing a person on a pedestal after learning something impressive about them is halo. Assuming the worst about a person because of a negative observation is the horn bias. A tendency to obey persons in authority is authority bias. It happens when we rely on pre-existing information. That's your anchor bias. Facial expressions or gestures affecting our decisions are non-verbal. Okay, so everyone, the first program code is bias. Again, please write it down on a piece of paper, a post-it so that you put it on your screen. Do not lose it. I'm going to keep this up for another 30 seconds so that you can find a piece of paper and a pen and write it down somewhere where you can find it, because I can't repeat it once I leave this screen. Leaving the screen in 10 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so now that we know that these implicit biases may exist, is there any way that we can measure it? Is there any way that we can reinforce the fact that we have, which of these biases we have, right? So we know that we can measure explicit biases. We've been measuring them throughout history, right? So we can look at history and say you know, we have we've had racism that was overt for many, many years. We've had slavery in the US, we had the Jim Crow laws in the South, which enforced the practice of segregation, redlining or zoning ordinances that prohibited Black people from living in specified neighborhoods. The mid 1900s, we begin to see changes happening with respect to racism, right? 1948, Truman eliminated segregation in the military. 1954, the Supreme Court decided Brown versus Board of Education, holding that segregation of schools was unconstitutional. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed discrimination in employment and voting. And as very near and dear to all of your hearts is the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which prohibited discrimination in housing and remains an important civil rights act to date. So we see throughout history, we can measure that while change is slow, racism is not as accepted today as it used to be, and while it's not entirely eliminated, we can absolutely measure change. But how do we measure something that is hidden, especially since we don't even know that these biases exist in our subconscious, right? So an attempt was made. It's called the implicit association test, and I thought it would be helpful as an illustration to show you a part of one. So a team of researchers, one of whom was the founder of the concept of implicit bias by the name of Mazarin Banaji. Miss Banaji is a Harvard professor and a psychologist, and her team launched what's called Project Implicit. It is online if you look at Project Implicit, and they created what's called this implicit association test. So I'm going to let the video explain it, and I'll further explain it after the video.
Implicit Association Test, or IAT. In a classic version of the IAT, research participants are asked to make two types of judgments. The first is whether a face they see on the computer screen is that of a Black person or a white person. And the second is whether a word they see on the screen is a good word or a bad word. A good word would be like love, joy, or honest. And a bad word would be like poison, agony, detest. The trials with the faces, black or white, are intermixed with the trials with the words, good or bad. And participants must use the same two keys on the computer for both judgments. So in one part of the test, participants will use one key to indicate black if a black face is shown, and use that same key to indicate good if a good word is shown. Then a different key will be used for white for face trials and bad for word trials. In a different part of the test, things are arranged differently. Now participants use one key to indicate black and bad, and the other key to indicate white and good. This experiment assesses how easily the participants can manage each of these links. Do they have an easier time putting white and good together, and so using the same key to indicate both, than putting white and bad together? It turns out that the second combination is easier for white participants and many African American participants as well. This seems to suggest that the participants arrive at the experiment already primed to associate each race with a certain evaluation and respond more slowly when the experiment requires them to break that association.
Okay, so what is it actually testing, this implicit association test? It is not a score, it is not a grade. Okay, let's start off by saying that there's no, it's not a real, true measurement like we know a true measurement. It's not a pass fail. There's no 70% of the knowledge. There's no 30% of the knowledge, right? These are this test measures, and what this video didn't tell you was, as those words come, as you progress through the test, the same words and facial and faces come faster. They progressively become more rapidly come, so that your reaction to black is bad or white is good is automatic because of the speed that they're coming in. So the idea is your association is so deeply ingrained in your brain that this test will show whether or not you have what your associations are with respect to black or white. Okay, there are many association tests that were invented by the project Implicit, but this one I thought was more relevant to this lecture than any other ones. So the idea is that your response is easier when two things are so deeply related that in a person's mind that they share the same response key. If you truly associate black with good, the faster your response time in associating black with good. So what does this test really mean? Your biases, your implicit biases, are either slight, moderate, or strong. A faster response time between two associations suggests a stronger implicit association with that subject. The faster response times to black is bad, the stronger your implicit association to black is bad. So how does this help? Does this mean you're prejudiced if you score high, if your reaction time to black is bad is higher than black is good? So according to the researchers, showing an implicit preference for a group over another group does not mean you're prejudiced, because some who show a preference for one group over another are prejudiced against that group, but some are not. Also, the results are not a direct measure. Like I said, this is not a numerical value. There's no numerical value assigned here of what is happening, right? It's not a direct measure of prejudice because it's not a measure of explicit bias. And being prejudiced is an explicit bias. So these implicit biases are not necessarily personally endorsed by the person who is taking the test and may be contradictory to what they believe. And as the studies show, you can be prejudiced against black people and find black and have an association, a very strong association to black is good. It doesn't consider, this test doesn't consider negative associations with black persons, and why you have those negative associations with black persons. So your preference over a group is it could be because you find black to be good, even though you're prejudiced against blacks because you're familiar with that group. For instance, your best friend in elementary school was a black person, and you've been to many of their family functions and know the culture well. So your association, your implicit associations with black people are good, right? Even though you have a prejudice, you can be prejudiced to black people. Consider it's possible that implicit biases is what leads to unfamiliarity, is probably because of unfamiliarity with certain groups and negative associations that we don't want to learn about a certain groups as part of the reason why we have these negative associations to a certain culture. But this implicit association test does give us some indication of how to determine our actions on a go forward. Okay, it allows us to actively challenge bias attitudes towards conscious effort and behavior change. So while it is not as reliable as we think, I think that, and I actually took it and surprised myself with the associations. It's quite difficult, to let your unconscious mind work. It's because it's as the things as the associations get faster throughout the test, your conscious brain is fighting with your unconscious brain, and it's you're fighting with which hand, because which hand you are going to press. So it's an interesting exam, just for point of interest. I think everybody should take it just to give themselves a baseline, shall we say. Okay, so another reinforcer for you. The implicit association test confirms your conscious biases. Is that true or false? That is false. The implicit association test uses a white face and a black face with positive words, and the results are timed. If the participant is faster at associating white faces with positive words and black faces with negative words, that would indicate a possible implicit bias against Black people, depending on the scoring. Keep in mind that this would be an unconscious response and does not indicate that the participant holds any conscious bias, explicit bias. Okay, so as I said, there are many biases, implicit bias tests. You can go ahead and look on Harvard and put in Google Harvard and IAT tests, and these will all come up for you. And it gives you associations, for instance, weapons versus whether or not you associate them to be harmless objects. Okay, and Asians, European Americans, but these are on the website. All right, we are halfway there. So let's talk about some considerations related to the IAT. Does the IAT predict behavior? In other words, do your preferences in the IAT is it likely a good predictor of behavior? So the link between implicit biases and behavior are fairly small on average and can vary greatly. So, for example, someone with a strong white is good implicit preference may choose to hire a Black employee, and someone with a strong white is bad implicit preference may discriminate against Black persons in favor of less qualified white persons. So it's not a good predictor of what will happen explicitly. Can I rid myself of any implicit biases that I don't want? You cannot rid yourself of implicit biases. However, you can avoid situations where the implicit biases come into play. So for instance, if you're hiring, and I don't know how you would do this, but there are studies that have done this and they've been very successful. If you're hiring, remove the names from the resume. And so you don't have the name bias, the implicit name bias coming out to make your decisions, right? Another way to remove a bias is, keep an open mind that, the name bias exists. And so if the name is unfamiliar to you, you're more aware of the fact, like for instance, if it's a Toni Carlos, that's not a common name like my name. Toni Carlos is a more palatable name to many. So you won't be able to know that you shouldn't assume what a person's like because of their name. Know that it exists. If you have, for instance, a bias towards women, against women, and you watch some programs that are portray women in a positive light, so that if you know that bias may be affecting you, start putting women in a more positive light in your life, right? Do persons who belong to stigmatized groups, for instance, Blacks, gays, or old people, show a preference toward their own group in the test? And what they found was this IAT test does members of stigmatized groups tend to have more positive implicit bias attitudes towards their groups than those who are not in their group. Again, there's a moderate preference for the more socially valued group, right? But gay people may tend to show an implicit preference for straight people relative to gay people, but it's not as strong as the implicit preference shown by straight people relative to straight people. This result is likely because stigmatized members develop negative associations about their group from their cultural environments. Remember, as kids, jokes that necessarily place members of a group in a negative light may have stuck to that kid, right? So that they have negative associations about a group, but they have positive associations, consciously. Is it reliable? We discussed this a little bit, that it's not a measure like a school exam, right? So that 100% means you know all the material and 10% means you only know 10%. So psychologists disagree about the effectiveness of the IET in predicting discriminatory behavior, especially if the test is only taken one time. Why? Because if you take the exam multiple times, right, your responses could vary. It's almost like they say about 75% of the testers reveal automatic white preference to be it's automatic. And so when you go and take the test over and over again, it's influenced by you knowing that you have a preference towards that white is good. So it's now polluted the tests over and over again. I mean, your responses very, very, very slightly, but still it's polluted now by the associations that exist in you taking it over again, right? So the reliability is sketchy, right? But I think, is it valid? Determining whether a psychological test is actually measuring what it claims to measure is validity, right? So that means there must be a correlation between those two values, those two variables. So white is good, black is bad. And is it necessary, since we're seeing differences in the results of what you associate with implicitly versus what you consciously know, it's difficult to say that the test is actually valid. So, again, I think the IAT is helpful in determining, in learning about your implicit bias, possibly your implicit bias. And again, it's the after taking it, just to experience it, I think it gives you a surprising result. And you take it with a grain, but it does have some element of information that may not necessarily be reliable and may not necessarily be valid, but it makes you aware. So true or false? The implicit association test asks direct questions about whether the respondent has any negative stereotypes about various ethnic groups. Is that true or false? The answer to that is false. As we said, how do we discover the forms of implicit bias? One of the most widely used methods is called the implicit association test and is commonly referred to as the IAT. This IAT does not ask direct questions about whether the respondent has any negative stereotypes, but about various racial, ethnic, or other groups. Instead, it asks the respondents to sort 4 different categories into groups as quickly as possible. Okay, this is not a measure of your negative stereotypes, right? Another reinforcer, the IAT is not a reliable measure of implicit bias. Is that true or false? That is true. In order for a psychological test to be reliable, it must have a low level of measurement error. In simple terms, does it come up with the same measurement each time the test is run? All tests will have the same level of measurement of error, but the lower that is, the higher the reliability. This is usually determined by having people take the test repeatedly to see if they show the same results. All right, so I wanted to just go over this Newsday investigation. I'm positive that all of you are very aware of what happened here. So as many of you know, back in 2019, Newsday published its findings after a 3-year-long study of housing discrimination on Long Island. There were 86 pair tests, similar profiles of these persons requesting identical terms for houses in the same area. 39 tests paired Black and white people together. So if just in case someone is new and did not read the article that's on the call, these pair tests, it means that they saw the same 2 people, one Black, one white, or one Asian, one white, or one Black, one Asian, saw the same agent, pair testing, and they determined how this same agent reacted to the white person, the Black person, the Asian person, and the Latino person. And so there were 39 tests paired Black and white, 31 paired Hispanic and whites, and 16 paired Asians and whites. 10 white testers, 15 minority testers, 5,800 listings were offered. Areas were from New York City to the Hamptons, North and South Shores. And they tested 12 of the top performing real estate brokers and 93 agents. So what Newsday found that bias exists amongst the 93 agents. Bias is the tendency or inclination, remember, the conscious or unconscious that influences your judgment or decision making in favor or against a group. And the most common bias was steering, which is a very unlawful practice of sorting homes home buyers based on their race. So some were overtly biased and some unconsciously biased, but the findings were that 40% of the time, agents subjected the tester to unequal treatment. Blacks experienced the highest rate of discrimination, 49%, followed by Hispanics at 39%, and Asians at 19% of the time. In 7 of the tests, 8% of the agents accommodated white testers while imposing more stringent conditions on minorities. Commonly, agents refused to provide house listings or home tours to minorities unless they were pre-qualified. Again, steering, how did these agents steer home buyers? By talking about backgrounds of people who live in the neighborhoods. One agent actually advised a Black customer, every time I get a new listing in Brentwood, I get so excited because they're the nicest people, quote unquote, while advising a white tester, please kindly do some research on the gang-related events in this area for safety. Brentwood is home to the MS-13 gang members and is 79% Hispanic and Black. So you cannot steer your buyers towards certain areas. One agent actually said, I'm not going to send you to anything in Wyandanch unless you don't want to start your car to buy your crack, unless you just want to walk up the street. So egregious. Okay, I'm sure that all of you on this call have seen the videotape. If not, Google it. It's too big to be part of your materials. But I did include the link so that you can look at they were videotaped testing, so that you can witness exactly these statements. Very, very shocking, actually, that this was taking place right in our own backyard, and I'm sure all of you were shocked at the level of egregiousness that you saw. So how do you guard against some of this, right? Use protocols. If your broker is not using protocols in their shop, you've got to suggest that they use protocols. For instance, requiring pre-qualification for every single purchaser, every single one. No ifs, ands, or buts. That's protocol, right? So you can't favor one race over another if it's part of your process to require pre-qualifications, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion education, or DEI education, which is why you're here today. Unfortunately, some of these agents are still negotiating or have been found guilty and, have been fined by the real estate board, licenses revoked. It matters. And that's why I think it's important to know what implicit biases are. And even if you doubt they exist, I think being aware that they may exist, okay, is something that you can put in your back pocket and say to yourself as you make these decisions for your buyers or your sellers. Know that your decisions may happen to include some of your implicit biases, okay, and question your decisions of protocol or of your choices based on what you understand from today's materials. So I'm just going to give you some more examples. That way it's a little bit more practical for everyone. so we can see the biases play out. The first one deals with a broker, a real estate agent by the name of Sam. He's a salesperson and agent for the Jones family, who's a black family. Jones is looking for a home in the Willowbrook neighborhood, predominantly black neighborhood, but Jones did not specifically state that they wanted to be in a black neighborhood. Sam found the Jones family in the Willowbrook area, and a week later, and they were very happy. And a week later, a black couple, the Taylors, asked Sam to find them a home. And based on how happy the Jones family was with the Willowbrook home, Sam focused his search in that neighborhood. So is there any bias taking place here? Implicit bias, likely confirmation bias. Remember, this is a bias that is triggered when you're confronted with information that is contrary to your beliefs or understanding. As it turns out, the reason why the Jones family wanted a home in the Willowbrook area is because they wanted to be close to an elderly mom. So ask questions. Ask as many questions as possible. Do not leave things to chance in your own brain. Don't assume things in your own mind, because your biases could result in an unhappy purchaser. So know that confirmation bias exists, right? Availability bias may also have a play here. Or your most recent vivid memories influenced your judgment, right? Because of the happy family, the Jones family was so happy with the Willowbrook area, your mind's inclination is to look there again when it concerns another Black family. So know that those two biases could play a role in your decision making. Ask questions of your buyers and your sellers in terms of their preferences, because this is about them, not you. Bob. Bob is a broker who owns XYZ real estate. Bob worked with two buyers and recommended they get pre-qualified. Both prospects had poor credit scores and marginally likely to obtain a loan. First prospect agrees to every effort to improve credit score and to come back once again. The second prospect mentions to Bob that he graduated from the same colleges as Bob. Bob spends extra time with that second prospect, advising on how to improve his credit score. Again, these are protocols, right? You have to have protocols. Affinity bias is at play here. Subconsciously, we favor people who we feel share our interests, beliefs, and background because we get a sense of familiarity and comfort from them, right? Bob spent more time with the person who graduated from his college because of his implicit associations with a good feeling about his college and his positive experience from his college. He now favors one over another. Let's talk about Steve, who has an appointment to show a home to a prospect at 10 a.m. The prospect is late. Steve calls, but the prospect doesn't answer. Steve is about to leave, and the prospect shows up at 10:30. Steve is irritated because he has several other showings. He shows the property to the late prospect, but his heart's not in it. So what's at play here? People evaluate attribution bias. People evaluate their behavior or behavior of others and draw conclusions from them. So Steve assumed that the prospect was rude or lazy, or he associates some sort of negative association with this late purchaser. And he then shows the property, but without any interest in the purchaser. So because your implicit bias here may be at work, you may have lost this purchaser to somebody else because of your attitude towards this purchaser, not even knowing that the reason why, look, you can be annoyed at the fact that he's late, but your protocol is to show the house with the same uh, vivaciousness, shall we say, that you show the house to another person who isn't late, right? So protocols have to be in place, and it'll lessen your decision making on your own. Let's talk about Leslie. Littletown Realty is a small real estate office with 5 agents. The principal broker generates 70% of the office's income. The principal broker has a very dominant personality. Sorry for the misspelling. The principal believes the path to success is to limit prospecting to homes that are at or above the mean value of the community. So Leslie is a new salesperson who just joined Littletown Realty, and she prospects homes that are below median sales prices because she believes those homes have not been sought after as much as the others. The second highest income producer of Littletown Realty tells Leslie her idea will fail. So this second highest income producer is likely using some of the conformity bias. Individuals change their beliefs or behavior to align with opinions or actions of a larger group, even if they personally hold different views. So the second highest producer is influenced by conformity bias and wanting to agree with the group that follows the lead of the principal broker. So what is this doing to this real estate office? It's limiting the pool of neighborhoods that you're going to, and also limits your choice of buyers, right? Because of conformity bias. Victoria. Victoria is a broker who's looking to hire a new salesperson. There are 2 applicants, one attractive female, recently graduated 3rd in her class, with a business degree, but no sales experience. The second candidate is an average looking male with no college degree, but 2 years of sales experience in real estate, and generated slightly above average sales for salespersons in this area. And the broker in turn hires the woman. So 2 implicit biases may be at play here that influenced Victoria's decision. One may be the halo effect. You're putting a person on a pedestal because of her schooling and her attractiveness. The other is the horn effect, which is the broker felt negatively about the male because of his lack of education or his appearance. So those 2 kind of work in tandem with each other. But you may have had made the wrong decision here because of your biases. Let's talk about Giannis Antetokounmpo. And it took me a while to figure out how to say that, so I had to listen to ESPN when this guy was playing. But he's an actual basketball player with a very, and it's actually called Giannis. His name is actually Giannis Antetokounmpo. Giannis is a star, and he's still a basketball star playing for the Milwaukee Bucks. Is a retired player, and he wants to sell real estate. Giannis has many contacts. He applies to a small real estate firm. The broker does not hire Giannis, and the name bias here is at play. It's entirely possible that the broker has a name bias because Giannis is not, it's difficult to pronounce, and it's not a warm and fuzzy name, right? It's not something we're comfortable with. So could the reason be that he's inexperienced? Yeah, it could be, but and there could be no implicit bias working here at all. But Giannis is fully trainable with the many contacts. You would think that a broker would want their play at the contacts Giannis may have, right? We see that all the time, where you buy the contact list, not necessarily the salesperson, and you groom them. So Charlie is a broker. He advises his sales associates that when showing several properties to the same buyer, start with the house with the highest listing price. It's better sales strategy. So what will result in the buyer here? It's not the person, the actor here. It's actually the buyer, and what you're playing on is the buyer's anchor bias. If the agent shows the highest priced home among those that would meet the prospect's needs and desires, that becomes the starting point. The prospect may or may not purchase the higher priced home, but it may make them more willing to pay a higher price rather than if the lower priced homes were shown first. So the first number sets that anchor. Remember that. John. John is the hiring manager for a very large real estate brokerage firm. He's hiring a new compliance officer. He has two applicants. One is a 47-year-old with 2 years of experience in compliance from a much smaller firm. The other is a 62-year-old with 20 years of experience from a large firm, but not as large as John's firm. And John hires the younger applicant. Ageism is at play. Is the case of implicit bias due to age. It's not really 100% clear that that's what's happening, but know that that may play a part. So John should think about what as he's hiring, and he knows the ages. And this is one of the things that kind of bamboozle you as a decision maker, right? Is the fact that certain situations trigger your implicit biases without you knowing it. And your decisions are based on the fact that your implicit bias has been triggered. So what do you do in this situation where you're interviewing two applicants? It's difficult to remove the bias. Like, for instance, what I said was remove the names, and you'll only have their experience and education. But it's difficult in this situation, especially in informal situations. So all you can do is be aware that these implicit biases may occur. And as you're making your decision, you talk to yourself and say, why do I really want to hire the 47-year-old versus the 62-year-old? Am I being fair, knowing that one is younger than the other? Am I, like this, bring it to your conscious. That's the whole point of this implicit bias course, is to bring the implicit to the forefront, knowing that the list of 20 exists, okay, will give you some sort of broader way to make your decisions. It gives you more information and gives you much more conscious decision making. So instead of, like, for instance, the example where the agent was waiting for a late prospect, don't get yourself in a tizzy when someone's late. You know why? That triggers, because you're not conscious when you're upset, that triggers your implicit biases. It automatically does, because you're not conscious when you're angry. So yes, he's late. Let it, you're allowed to be upset. but don't let it make your decision for you. Similarly, when you're hiring, you've got to bring the implicit bias to your forefront and make your decision using the tool that you now have. Let's talk about Elliot. Elliot is a broker and is hiring a new sales manager. He has 2 applicants. One has 10 years experience with above average sales, is 6 feet tall. The other one, same experience, above average sales, and is 5'7". So Elliot hires the taller applicant. Height bias could be at play here. Again, you've gotta bring it to your forefront to see if in fact you're making the right decision, right? I have another reinforcer here for you. You can permanently remove your implicit biases. Is that true or false? Okay, so the answer to that is obviously, I hope obviously, is obviously false. There have been any number of theories about how to rid yourself of implicit bias. And if you research that, you will find it. I did. But no one has found any way to actually remove them, right? Remember, the automatic brain is not part of your conscious brain. It's the biggest strength is being able to make comparisons incredibly quickly, your unconscious brain. Its biggest weakness, your unconscious brain, is that sometimes these comparisons do not reflect what our reflective brain tells us. Okay, so we are now on to the last program code. The second program code is race. Again, please write it on a piece of paper. It will not be repeated once I leave this slide. So please write it down on the same piece of paper, hopefully that you have the first program code on. Ten more seconds. So in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, so we've come to the end of our journey with implicit bias. I just want to, so where do we go from here? I just want to reiterate to everyone that implicit biases don't make you a bad person, okay? We all have these implicit biases because we all have had personal experiences with race, ethnicity, gender. We've all had them as kids, as, adults. So what our brain takes from those experiences, it stores without you even knowing. So remember that just because you have negative associations towards a certain group, as you may find when you're doing some of these IAT tests, does not make you a bad person. It makes you completely normal because everybody has it, right? These are completely outside of your control. And the intention here is for you to have the knowledge, right? To know yourself and to be aware of what these biases are, to help you make your decisions in a much more conscious way, having new tools in your possession, right? Take the IAT test. Even if you're rolling your eyes, it doesn't exist, Toni, you're crazy. It's not even reliable. It's not even valid. You know what? Learn something new about yourself. Maybe it will give you something new about yourself. and maybe you'll find that, you know what, fangled, crazy.
I will share. I actually took them
Yeah.
when because we do a lot of CLEs for attorneys. So when they brought out the diversity credit a few years ago, I went to a big seminar, and part of that was taking the tests. So I took two of them, one based on race and one based on gender roles.
Hmm.
I took the one for race, it was low. I took the one for gender roles, it was moderate. I'm a full-time working mom. I make almost the same amount as my husband. I use all the tools. I do everything. But my brain made me more biased on gender roles. I grew up in a traditional household. My dad made more money. My mom stayed home. So my brain had the gender roles to a moderate level. So even though I don't practice that in my own life, I
Yes.
work, obviously there are things my husband can do that I can't, but in my head, in my brain,
Sure.
unconsciously, I had those biases to gender roles.
Right. It just you can't help it, right? It's not something that's in your conscious brain. But it has taught you to become more mindful of when you make decisions. So make sure that you don't put yourself in situations where your implicit biases will play a part. Okay. Follow your protocols. Make sure you have protocols. If your broker doesn't have protocols, which is crazy, knowing all this, establish protocols for yourself. Okay. That way your implicit biases are at bay. They don't take over your decisions. Avoid your stressors, are working while frustrated. Which gives you states of mind where you're vulnerable to having your implicit biases work against you. And avoid assumptions. Oh, ask so many questions. Ask so many questions of your buyers. Ask so many questions of your sellers. It's okay to be annoying. You know what? You're doing them a service. You're doing them a service because the more questions that you ask and you have answers to, the less likely you will have the less likely that your brain will think on its own. Don't want that. You want your brain to think consciously in the present moment. Okay. So lastly, just be good to each other. Be good to each other. I know that it's been difficult. This whole diversity, race, gender. It's all been very difficult to navigate. I do these courses in hopes that it makes a difference. Because obviously, I'm a real estate attorney first, and a title attorney first, but this has become part of my journey as a minority person. And it's interesting to me, and it kind of validates the fact that certain actions toward me now make sense to me. So it helps with this whole diversity, navigate through the whole diversity issues. It gives you much more control over what you're thinking. So I hope that each of you take a little bit of something from today. I know it's hard to believe that these things exist, but they do. It's backed by science. So hopefully you have taken something from today's seminar. So are there any questions, Diana?
I think you got to any questions that were in the chat. If anyone has a question, they can just unmute themselves and speak. But in the meantime, I just wanted to say thank you so much for a great lecture. Right after the seminar, I'm going to resend you the survey and the affirmation. You can just, the survey is online. The affirmation, you could just email right back to me and I'll get it to the CE school. So I'll send that within the next 15 or 20 minutes so you can get it out of the way. And also, reply to me, day, time, topic. This is our first online CE that we've done for realtors. We do a lot of CLEs for attorneys, but we'd like to bring you more classes. So please share with me your thoughts. We would really appreciate it. And I wanted to thank everyone for coming again. And thank you, Toni, for a great lecture.
You're very welcome, and I hope to see everyone soon. Take care.
Have a great day, everyone.